no texture. So the whole goal with this is to obviously keep like a nice little fade underneath that lower fade and then work it into some longer length. So the first thing I'm gonna do is work through it with my clipper over comb. And so when I'm working through with that clipper, I wanna hold it like it's a remote control. And when I'm making contact with that comb, I want it to be flat across that comb. I don't wanna rake across the ends of that comb. And so what I'm looking to do here is to build that length. So at the shortest point should really be around the hairline and getting longer as it works towards that parietal ridge. And so the whole goal and focus of that is to make sure that I'm achieving some type of support and balance for the length that lives at the top. And so when we're working with that, we want to make sure that we're staying consistent as we work around the head. And so when I get to this area just above the occipital bone, you can see my comb is angling out this way. I'm not working with that round of the head, because if I work with the round of that head, I'm not going to have the opportunity to transition this length into the top area of the head shape. So really I want to focus on having that nice rounded silhouette so that it doesn't look like a undercut that hangs over the length from the top, hangs over. Because if it's too short, I'm not going to have the support that you can kind of see there with those dogs. And so when we're working clipper over comb, a lot of times people will ask like, well, why would I use clipper over comb as opposed to working with a larger guard, like a 4 or 5 or something like that? Is it not a lot easier? Well, not necessarily, because what ends up happening, that guard isn't going to be as consistent, and also it's not going to give you that customizable shape that you will be able to have when you're working with clipper over comb. And it also doesn't take into account any lighter density spots. When you're working, serious thinking, I'm talking to her. So when you're working around the ear, this tends to be a much lighter density area of the head shape. And so, and I'm sure everyone here is, when you take and you hit that with a guard, you're like, oh, that's real short. Okay? So when you're working with clipper over comb, it makes it a lot easier to be able to compensate for some of those areas. And so once I debulk, I kind of move that length down, because that's what we're really doing here. When you're taking that bigger guard to debulk, all you're doing is trying to minimize the shape of that haircut. If I have someone who comes in with a lot of hair and they're like, hey, I want like a skin fade, tight skin fade, that can be really intimidating until you start to reduce the bulk of that haircut. And so I'm gonna first start with just a little taper here on the sides, and I'm gonna work with my clipper in that open position first. And so as I work it down into the beard as well, I just want to start to close this little by little. And I'm using this brush just to remove the hair off the skin. So I know a lot of times you might see barbers when they're working with a comb or a little brush, and that's really the whole purpose of it, is to create that little bit of a blend and get that looser hair away from the scalp. And so I'll finish the taper here on the side, and I'll do the exact same thing into that nape area. I'm going to start with that clipper in that open position. And so you can see, even as I'm moving with that clipper, I'm not using a wrist motion, right? I think that's one common mistake that we find a lot when you're working and training with new haircutters, is that there's way too much wrist motion as opposed to controlling that clipper with your fingers in your hand. It makes for a lot better of a transition. And so when you're working with that, it's important to understand there's a couple of reasons why people may move their wrist and instead of their hand. Is number one, if they're holding the clipper incorrectly, like too much further down onto the tool, that bodes for more of that wrist motion, or if the clipper is too heavy, right? That's what I find. That one of those things are happening, it's usually going to be the clipper's too heavy, or they're just holding it in the wrong position. And so now I'm going to work back through and start to blend this length in. I'm going to use my number 1 guard. And so what I'm working here now is more of that toe to heel motion with the clipper. So when you're looking at it, you can see the clipper has a bend to it. And it's supposed to work from the toe to the heel, just like your foot. All right, so you're working toe to heel motion as opposed to just making it look like you're just going up the head shape. That tends to be the reason why people will push lines higher and higher up on the haircut, is because that motion is just not as consistent as it needs to be. And so I'm going to come right back to the area in the nape and do the same thing. Just working, kind of floating across that length here in the back. Nice light motions, and you can see even I'll use my opposite hand as a little bit of a pivot to kind of control that length. And so because, when you're working with a lot of newer people behind the chair, you have to give them things that are going to make it a lot easier for them to work with. I work a lot with students and also a lot with newer barbers, and so a lot of times they don't have that dexterity and that muscle memory in the hand to be able to control it by itself. So by giving them that little bit of an option to use that other hand just to kind of help them out a little bit, works a lot better in understanding the control of that tool. And so now I'm just going to connect the dots around the side. So I work with the taper in the side and the taper in the neck. Now I'm just going to connect here over the ear. And the reason I went through that route as opposed to trying to work it around the head in one fell swoop is because oftentimes the rounds of the head tends to be the hardest part and where most people get lost in the sauce on their blends. The flatter parts of the head are the easiest parts to blend. When you start moving around some of those rounds, that's when it tends to get a little bit more difficult. So by just working with this manner and allowing myself to connect the dots over the ear, it works a lot easier, and I'm able to stay a lot more consistent as I work through the haircut. And so even working around the ear, I'm just gonna angle that clipper a little bit. As you can see, the teeth of my guard here aren't really even touching the scalp, right? The teeth at the top, only the ones at the very bottom are even making contact with the skin because I wanna keep this blend lower to the head shape as I can. Okay? I'm gonna switch on this side so you guys can see just a little bit. And I'm gonna repeat the same process. So I'll start in with that open clipper. All right, so when it comes to barbering, it's really like a math equation. Whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. And the earlier you can teach that to a newer haircutter, the better. I can remember being a new barber and working in the shop, and I could only show my clients one side of the haircut when it finished. Right? Because I was so not confident on the other side. And they would see the mirror and I'm like, hey, can I see the other side? No, it's okay, bro, it's good. It looks just like the other side, right? But in all reality, it didn't look like the other side at all. You're gonna have a much more difficult time controlling it, especially when you're coming through with your scissors on the top. All right, and so the first thing I'm kind of looking at here is where I'm gonna start this haircut. And so what I want to do is separate and section out this length that's beyond the apex. So a couple ways that I can discover that is if I comb this hair all towards me, work it through, and then push it lightly forward, I can see exactly where that hair wants to split. Right? Just based off, and that would happen on a real person as well. And so the other way to go about doing that is if I lay the comb flat on the head, right where it starts to fall off the head shape, I know that's exactly where I need to split that, right? And so what I'm gonna start with is a center section from the apex going down into the occipital bone, right? So you can see me working. And so what I wanna focus on, first, I'm gonna use that length that we left at the occipital bone as my guide because I want to connect this length in pretty well. And so the only thing is I'm not going to blunt cut this, right? As I lay this over my fingers, I can see exactly where my guide is at. I really just want to kind of point cut this length off. And the reason for that is it allows for me to work with that curl a lot more naturally as opposed to blunt cutting that off. And so one thing, a good point to remember when you're working through and point cutting is to lay that hair over your fingers as opposed to trying to hold it straight out here, right? When I lay it over my fingers here, it allows for me to not only see the guide, but I can also see the blade of that scissor too, right? Okay, and so just making sure here, I want to work through, I'm not using a lot of tighter tension, right? I'm really just allowing that hair to kind of rest in my fingers because I don't want to disrupt this curl too much. So I'm going to kind of pivot off of these sections as I work throughout the back. I don't want to use any over direction here. I just want to focus on cutting this hair straight out from where it lives. Too much over direction is going to build the length way too much as I work towards the corner of the ear. Or excuse me, toward that masculine process behind the ear, I should say. So same thing here, I want to lay that hair over my finger. Then I want to focus on doing the exact same thing on the opposite side. I'm going to stay on the same side as I'm cutting, just because, when you're working with your fingertips pointed down like this, it's a lot easier to connect those dots, as opposed to if I were trying to switch sides and contort my body to cut it a different way. And so you notice here how I'm moving my guest, right? I know sometimes when we're working behind the chair, even myself included, like I have a tendency to not want to move around the chair or move my guest around. But in order to cut this a lot more efficiently, I want to make sure that I'm moving my body around the guest, or at least turning the guest, so that I'm able to work through without any over direction. So this is not the part where I want any kind of over direction. When we work towards the top, in order to create that longer length, we're going to work with more over direction. So one adjustment that you could make here, like if I was working with someone who had a lower density, and maybe they didn't have as full of amount of pearls as my guest. What's his name today? I'm gonna name him Ricky today. He looks like he could be a Ricky, right? Right? So Ricky's hair is a little bit more dense as opposed to maybe someone else with this type of curlier hair. They may not have as much density, especially once you start moving towards the top of the haircut. So now that I'm working through the top, I'm gonna lower Ricky down just a little bit. And so what I want to do is take a section that works across the head shape. So if I'm standing behind it, that would be horizontal. And so I want to use that length that we've already created as my guide, and I'm going to over direct just slightly onto that length. And I can see that right there. And so once I get towards the sides, what I want to do is just round this off just slightly. I'm not connecting it into that length that's at the parietal ridge, but what I do want to do is just round my fingers just a little bit to the bone structure so that it creates some type of silhouette as we're working around the head shape. If I were to hold this hair straight up towards the ceiling, or everything straight up, even that length at the parietal, I would end up with way too much of an overhang as I work throughout. So same thing here, next section up, and I'm gonna over direct back onto the previous section. And so when you're working with over direction, you gotta think of it like a bow and arrow, right? Or a slingshot. The more you pull that bow and arrow or that slingshot towards you, the more distance you're gonna get in the opposite direction. In hair, it's the exact same thing. The longer I pull it, or the more I should say, I pull this hair towards me, the longer that length is going to get in the opposite direction. So that's one reason why I choose to start from the apex area as opposed to starting at the front hairline, right? When you start at the front hairline, it's a lot harder to kind of adjust that length once you've already stamped that length in at the front hairline. So I just want to stay consistent here, taking smaller sections or small enough sections as needed. Sometimes when we are cutting curlier hair like this, if you take too large of a section, what happens? You lose the guide, right? And then after a while, once you're in it, you're like, man, well, here we are. It's curly, so it's not going to show. But you want to make sure that you're using smaller sections, especially as trainers. That's one of the biggest things that I find in working with newer learners, newer barbers and stylists, is that when it comes to cutting that curlier texture of hair like this, you want to make sure that you're using smaller sections and lighter tension, which is going to make it a lot easier to work with. And so you're seeing a lot more of this texture of hair. There's even a lot of guys who are going to get perms, right? Just so they can have this texture of hair. So you want to make sure that as communities change and things like that happen, you want to make sure that you guys, your stylists are prepared in order to handle that demand and that difference of trend that's coming in the industry, or it's already here in the industry. And so just as I'm kind of getting to that last couple sections here, what I really want to be thinking about is just what type of product would be best for the guest with this hair, right? With this haircut and also with this hair texture. So the first couple things I really want to think about is just what's the lifestyle of my guest? And what I mean by lifestyle is not necessarily what they like to do, but also like what is their daily regimen, their routine? What kind of job do they have? Right? Do I want this person to have something that's going to be higher maintenance, especially if they're a lower maintenance kind of person? Or is this a person that's going to like to blow dry their hair? Are they going to diffuse their hair? Are they going to just air dry it? These are all questions that you want to ask when you're working behind the chair, and also teaching to your stylist. Because number one, what this does is it builds that customer trust, right? Because it makes it really feel like you're involved in what that guest is doing. And then also it allows for you to suggest things that are applicable to what they need and what they do. So as I'm taking this last section here, I'm gonna over direct. I can see my guide, lay that hair over my finger, and it makes it a lot easier to work with when I'm coming through a point cut. And so what we're gonna work with this guest today is we're gonna work with a wetter style that can air dry a little bit better, or a little bit more rather. So we're gonna be working with round trip. And so what round trip is gonna do, and you guys are familiar with round trip, right? Yeah. So as you know, round trip is gonna really enhance that natural curl that you'll see in a haircut like this. Just wanna go through, make sure I got all the little pieces here. And so round trip is really just gonna enhance that natural curl. But what's something else you can do is, even we use on one of the dolls there, is you can diffuse that hair after you apply that round trip. So once I have it here into the front, you can see how it kind of falls right here into the face. So if I wanted to come through and just kind of carve some of that length out, I want to make sure that I'm not doing too much, because what happens to this texture of hair as it dries, it's going to shrink up, right? And so I want to make sure I'm not cutting too much of it off, because it'll mess up the entire look of what I'm trying to go for. So when I use round trip, I just want to get about 3 or 4 little bumps into my hand. And the biggest thing here is going to be distribution of the product to both hands, and then the application of it. So you want to work from the base to the ends. A lot of times people just zhuzh it right in the front. You don't really have that opportunity to get that full array of the product. So I'm going to work through circular motion, the palm of my hand. That's going to allow that product to get to the base. And so then I'll come through afterward and start to scrunch and place that hair exactly where it needs to be. And so I'm using that product just now just to kind of separate a little bit more of it.